you to be here with us today. We are here in the third webinar focused on the lessons learned and challenges for building regional security coalition in Africa. So we're going to have a short round from Central, Eastern, Western and Southern Africa. And just briefly, so I'm Amandine Gnanguênon, and I'm a former visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm also working now with the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Study, UNICRIS. And so, as I told you, this third webinar is part of a broad topic and project on trend of convergence and divergence in EU-Africa relations. And is actually part of the Jean Monnet project called REAR, a reassessment of relations between the EU and African regionalism. So this project is actually coordinated at the Institute for European Studies at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And I'm working there as an associate researcher with Elisa, who is here today, and Frank. And thank you again for this opportunity to work with you. So today we're going to have 5 speakers, 4 researchers and 1 specialist working at the EU Regional Advisory and Coordination Cell to the Sahel, Daniel, who is actually going to join us later due to technical issue. So basically the idea of this third seminar is to discuss the lessons learned and the challenges. So we're going to just cover some issues, some questions, not all, obviously, but among the questions we want to maybe try to find some answer. We're going to have a discussion about the experience of African states with building regional coalition, their motivation to create coalition, and whether they are different from Western countries, their state and unstate objective, and the resource they invest to achieve this coalition, and also a look at the main political, financial, and institutional obstacles to the creation of this coalition, the reasons of their success, and of course, basically the extent to which the EU support influenced the creation of this coalition, their survival, and how the EU takes into account this challenge experienced by this coalition in the development of their supports. So we're going to start now, and I'm just going to give now the floor to Yves to start the presentation. And Yves actually is going to set the stage and starting with a broad perspective of ad hoc coalition. Yves, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Amandine. I will quickly try to put on my slides again. I hope that you can see them in 1 second. So normally you should be able to see the slides if you can just give a thumbs up. Thanks. Good afternoon. Thank you, Amandine, for this excellent initiative and also for inviting me to provide a brief presentation here. What I'll try to do is to offer a bit of a bird's eye perspective on military coalitions and operations on the African continent in the past years. And I will focus specifically on the phenomenon of ad hoc coalitions, because what I will argue is that ad hoc coalitions might, on the short term, be seen as a gift. The potential detrimental longer-term effects of these informal or ad hoc coalitions for African peace and security and for the African peace and security infrastructures should not be underestimated. Now, much of what I'll be saying today builds on 2 fairly recent publications together with my Norwegian colleague Sean Karlsrud. Both are publicly available in Third World Quarterly and in Contemporary Security Policy. But that being said, what we have been doing is some collaborative research on institutional rapid response mechanisms, basically meaning troops that are on standby, ready to be deployed within a short time frame. Now, over the past 2 decades, we have seen a proliferation of these mechanisms within several regional arrangements. Think of the NATO Response Force, the EU battle groups, but most importantly for today, also think of the African Union Standby Force, which is basically built around contributions and commitments from the regional economic communities or the regional mechanisms. Now, what we observe is that what all these institutional mechanisms have in common is that despite the investments made in these mechanisms, it has not yet materialized in significant use in practice, in implementation. Rather to the contrary, if we look at military responses to crisis, security crisis across the African continent in recent years, what you repeatedly and perhaps even increasingly see is a tendency that when push comes to shove, it are rather ad hoc coalitions that are deployed, coalitions of the willing, as it is also often labeled. And with ad hoc coalitions, I mean these temporary groups of actors that agree to solve a particular conflict at a given time or location in more or less a non-institutionalized manner. We all know several of these examples. Think of the multinational joint task force fighting Boko Haram, created in January 2015 by those states threatened most by Boko Haram. Now, all of these countries of the multinational joint task force, of which Katarina will know much more, of course, they belong to two different regional economic communities, ECOWAS and ECAS. And in that sense, they also built on two different sub-regional standby brigades of the African Standby Force. Now, the multinational joint task force, as an example, it's a typical example of an ad hoc coalition, which is not a formal deployment of the African Union Standby Force, but it receives support from the standby brigades. It is authorized by the African Union Peace and Security Council, and when we look at it more closely, the planning capacities of the African Standby Force in ECAS and ECOWAS, they have been used to establish forward headquarters that could support the multinational joint task force headquarters. So in that sense, the joint task force, it has benefited from the technical capacity developed at the sub-regional level and at the headquarters of the African Standby Force. It draws upon the legitimacy of the African Union, but it does not formally use these mechanisms, these institutional mechanisms. And we can think of other examples as well. Think of the joint force of the Group of Five Sahel. This is a typical ad hoc coalition. It receives support, financial support and legitimacy from the African Union, from the European Union, but it remains an ad hoc operation in nature. Also, when we cast our net a bit wider, looking at more European-led, or should I say French-led initiatives like Serval, Berkane, most recently the Takuba Task Force, these are all typical examples of ad hoc coalitions. Now, this ad hoc tendency is, of course, not necessarily problematic. And it is also not that I ignore these institutional deployments by the EU, the African Union, or the UN. But what I would like to emphasize is that we should be aware of the consequences of this seeming ad hoc desire. Now, when we look at the literature on ad hoc coalitions, at first glance, that seems to be fairly optimistic about the use of ad hoc coalitions. Just to name a few clear advantages of going ad hoc, so to say. For instance, there is no need for achieving unanimity or consensus. You can just continue with the most like-minded states. You don't have to run through lengthy bureaucratic procedures, so no delays. And in that sense, these ad hoc coalitions might allow for more rapid responses, and they can maybe buy time as first entry forces or bridging forces for more institutional deployments at a later stage. So that's a clear advantage. In addition to that, when we think of flexibility, these ad hoc coalitions are not bound by geographical boundaries, such as the regional-oriented regional standby forces in the African Standby Force. And that obviously might also lead to responses which are much more tailor-made, maybe even more efficient. And then finally, the most obvious advantage is, of course, that you don't have to give up authority as a member state to an institutional level, so you remain in control of your own troops. And maybe what is also often overlooked is you don't set any precedent for an institutional deployment to a similar crisis at a later stage, which might perhaps be one of the reasons why these regional rapid response mechanisms have not been used so far. But what I think is, despite all these potentially positive implications, I have some reservations with this, and in the sense that maybe even call it a pessimistic view, that we often tend to overlook the potential deficiencies on the short and the longer term of such an ad hoc operation. So first and foremost, practice tells us that the mushrooming of ad hoc coalitions, for instance, in the Sahel region, might come with coordination problems. It might even come with issues of duplication. Think of what is often labeled the security traffic jam in the Sahel. I think we can find some examples there. But what is more, these informal or ad hoc deployments also come with problems about accountability, responsibility, chains of accountability in case of misconduct, misbehavior, operational problems. These are all much more ambiguous in these ad hoc coalitions. But what I want to raise particular attention to today, and that's maybe the main message, is the potential longer-term consequences of this ad hoc tendency. Because the tendency to prefer ad hoc over institutional responses might also come with a risk of undermining the credibility and the longer-term legitimacy of the regional security organizations within which mechanisms such as the African Standby Force are being developed. In that sense, ad hoc coalitions might call into question the continued relevance of the regional economic communities as building blocks of the African Standby Force, because these ad hoc coalitions allow to transcend these geographical boundaries. And this is also a question that I would like to ask to the other speakers. Maybe we can have a discussion about that at a later stage. Don't you think that this tendency to deploy ad hoc coalitions might ultimately also hamper the African peace and security architecture? Because with funding obviously also follows leverage, and when funding is given directly by the EU to, for instance, the joint force of the G5 Sahel, the African Union has very little leverage. And in that sense, a preference for ad hoc coalitions over more institutionalized frameworks might also lead to a growing disengagement of these African member states to invest money and capabilities in the development of the African Union's peace and security infrastructure. And it can perhaps even lead to a growing disinterest of donors to further spend money and funds on developing those African Union peace and security architectures. And that leads me to a final question that I want to raise here. If we think about, for instance, the European Peace Facility, which will take force as of the 1st of July, if I'm not mistaken, this will allow to fund non-African Union mandated operations, including ad hoc coalitions. It will also allow to fund ad hoc coalitions or operations outside of the African continent. What I wonder is in how far this will obviously create flexibility for the EU. It's beneficial for the EU. But couldn't we say that this might also lead to even more competition for EU funding, potentially at the expense of the institutional development of the African peace and security infrastructures? So I want to leave it at that for now. Maybe just as on a final note, the reflections that I presented here are part of a larger project which we're working on, funded by the Norwegian Research Council and led by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. So over the coming 4 years, we want to do some more research on this. And if you are interested in it, of course, feel free to get in touch. And I'll try to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you so much for this this background. Very useful, especially to see that actually ad hoc coalition is not an African specificity, and there is other ad hoc coalition in the world, and especially, I mean, your question is very relevant. The question of the impact on the African peace and security architecture, and I think we should have this in mind for the Q&A session. Now I'm going to leave the floor to Katarina for a geographical perspective on West and Central Africa. Katarina, please.
Katarina, you need to unmute.
Yeah, we can do this for 1 year and it still happens. What I was mumbling to myself is that I really enjoyed already the input by Yves, and I'm hoping that we are not preaching to the converted and to each other, because I suppose that we are all sharing some observations here about these ad hoc coalitions, about military initiatives in Africa. And just a few words on my own background. I wrote my PhD thesis at Leipzig University, and there I was focusing on the long-term development of military interventions in the Sahel, and starting from AFISMA, or MISEMA if you want, by ECOWAS, proposed in 2012 and 13, but then going on to the G5 Sahel, I looked into the MJTF as well, also into ASRIC, the African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crisis, and also the Nouakchott Process Intervention Force. And this is sort of the standpoint from which I'm coming. And currently I'm finishing a book which is based on that research, and my postdoctoral research I did here in Stockholm at the university, Södertörn University, which really looks into this geopolitical perspective that I think is also underestimated when it comes to African actors and African agency. The whole field of critical geopolitics has so far basically ignored African politics. So this is a bit my direction. And I will also try to share some slides with you just to get us through the different. Can you see it in full screen now? Aha, here we go. Through the different ad hoc forces. To remind ourselves of the Multinational Joint Task Force, this is one of the forces in West Africa and bordering on Central Africa. It is actually a force that has a long trajectory. If you go back to the 90s, in 2012, it was sort of relaunched from this pre-existing multinational joint security force. It always has been very strong Nigerian leadership in this force. Since 2012 and since 2009, Cameroon has been more engaged because initially this multinational joint security force was more against banditry and armed groups and not so much focused on one armed group. Or, I mean, the history of Boko Haram is a bit more complex, and the splintering and fracturing in the recent years. But let's say the aim is here, it is a ad hoc force that is aimed towards more or less one armed group, which is loosely called Boko Haram. And Cameroon has come in, and also Benin has come in, and in 2015 this force was revised, and here it was authorized by the African Union. And this is quite significant because it is an ad hoc force that had from the beginning African Union backing, was well coordinated with the African Union Commission. It is organized through the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which is supposed to oversee the political mandate, but when it comes to the military aspects and logistic information and communication systems, it very much depends on support from the African Union and the former Peace Support Operations Division. What is interesting here, if you look at the sort of political condition of these different countries, is that in particular between Nigeria and Cameroon, there has been a long history of border disputes and conflict, but in the joint fight against Boko Haram, this was overcome within this joint force to join forces. Niger and Benin are not militarily strong. Their militaries aren't very strong, but Benin, for example, is not just part of the MJTF as many reasons, because it goes with Nigerian policy in West Africa, but also because early on there were some reports and also some Boko Haram members that were captured that had ties to northern Benin and were Beninese. So from the Beninese government, there was much interest in joining this force. Chad, of course, under late Idriss Déby, has played an important role in also using this force. And here some of the aspects that Yves has mentioned as well come in, that of course this is something very desirable for the political leadership in all of these countries, because the EU is supporting this through the APF, in connection and via the AU, it's who is managing the finances with the LCBC. And here, of course, for the involved governments, they can get support and training and resources for their armed forces, and can claim domestic successes against armed groups. On the one hand, at the same time, they do not have to give up control of their troops. The troops are largely deployed on their own territories, which also helps in engaging the local population. And these countries and their leadership and their militaries do not have to worry about some of the more rigid human rights restrictions that would come with a UN mission or with an African Union mission, and they are more in charge of that. But long term, there is definitely there is a lack of a political strategy when it comes to this ad hoc force here against Boko Haram. And it's something we have seen also against the M23 in the Eastern DRC with the Force Intervention Brigade that was led by South Africa. It's this idea that there's one armed group, we will take it out, and then we continue. As a sort of brief introduction. Then to the G5 Sahel Joint Force. As we know, the G5 Sahel as an organization was established in 2014, and then some years later the Joint Force was launched. Here again, when it comes to this political process, the presidents in particular of the 5 countries were involved. And in the end, you have to say that this in the beginning was basically an elite club of presidents together with the French president who brought this into being. But in comparison to other initiatives, here very early on you had French support, you had EU support, you had German support, lots of European financial support that actually nursed this into being and made this into a regional organization and created durable institutions. And I remember quite strikingly a couple of years ago when you looked at how the staff, just the sheer volume of staff in Brussels working on G5 Sahel related issues and projects and all of this in comparison to Burkina Faso and the foreign ministry, where you had maybe 2 or 3 people who were engaged in this portfolio, similar in Mali. So it shows that it was this elite project. And of course, all these heads of state had different reasons for preferring it, but when it comes to Mali, it also has to be seen in the criticism that came from ECOWAS side towards the lack of implementation of the peace agreement and this very, very slow process in actually moving towards conflict resolution. And there, of course, having EU money that supports first this organization and then a joint force to prep up the militaries is, of course, something very welcome. And Amandine asked us to give some sort of recommendations, and I had to think the first recommendation I would give when it comes to European actors would be stop playing Berlin-Congo conference there, because what we actually see in particular with the G5 Sahel is how spatial semantics and the way of ordering space in Africa that comes from a European perspective with the added money has really disrupted a sort of regional organization of security institutions when it comes to West Africa. And I want to make this point a bit clearer here, especially when it comes to just more geopolitical imaginations that we have there. When you look at the Nouakchott Process Intervention Force, for example, which is by now largely forgotten, it was never deployed. It was proposed first in 2014, then there were some assessment missions from the AU 2016, but in the end, of course, it didn't go much further once the G5 Sahel Joint Force came along. But what is interesting here is that this Nouakchott Process Intervention Force aligned with the African Union Sahel strategy and their outlook on the region and which actors need to be involved to solve the security problems. And we see that Algeria would have been part of it, Libya and Nigeria were very much involved. And this Nouakchott process brought together a lot of stakeholders, while the G5 Sahel very much is a sort of spatial, when you look at the spatial outline of it, it maps onto the former European Union Sahel strategy since 2011 that was so obsessed with the location of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, based on intelligence briefings at the time that are at best contested of where this group is active. And it kind of took that to go further and say, oh, this is where the armed groups are spread, and this is why we need these 5 countries to combat instability. Another problem that this also shows is in comparison to the MJTF, where we have sort of one armed group that is the center of attention. With the G5 Sahel, there are 25 groups that are in target here. One last force I want to remind us all of, and I'm sure you know about the African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crisis. I think it also, the establishment of it, again showed us this desire for ad hocism, this desire for coalitions of the willing, this desire for militarily robust years, and also to have a lead nation. It was very much it changed over the years, but after some years it really started showing a sort of NATO conception under it, and you could see that the NATO liaison that are at the African Union, but also in these different member states, that there's a sort of cultural transfer happening where African militaries are increasingly interested in modeling their interventions according to that. But as you know, it was a highly politicized process, mainly due to Zuma in South Africa, and that it was associated with him. And that, for example, Nigerian representatives were very much against it, because it seemed as if it was undermining the African standby force and into regional forces. So by now it is integrated into the African standby force. It was never deployed, but it shows really that since many years we are observing this trend towards coalitions. And it was an attempt, I think, to institutionalize this and how to deploy without leaving APSA behind. But I would leave it as that. And I think it already opens a whole range of problems that we see with this growing desire for ad hoc deployments. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Katerina. I already see one shared features with if it's the question of the long-term political strategy is missing actually for this ad hoc coalition. But I would say the question is who is supposed to provide this political strategy? Because we can imagine that African states have an idea of what they want to do with this coalition. But when we are saying that political strategy is missing, we should maybe try to look a little bit deeper to see who is supposed to provide this political legitimacy, this political strategy. But we can keep it for the Q&A session. Maybe we can continue the round in Africa. And Ali, if you're here, you can just bring some insights about Eastern Africa. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amandine. Great to see some of former colleagues and friends. I won't talk much, but I just want to show. I just want to take a single case to show the complexity and dynamism of regional coalitions, regional interventions in the Eastern Africa, and that is, in the form of, the Ethiopian unilateral intervention in Somalia at the end of 2006. And, in the framework of course, initially IGASOM, the IGAD force in Somalia, and of course later in a very different, of course, mechanism and framework, and diplomatic and political engagements and deal makings, of course, became AMISOM. Of course, I think, as most of you know, the Horn is probably, arguably, one of the most conflict-ridden regions. It's the only place in the African continent where two liberation movements, of course, resulted in the creation of two independent nations in the past 30 years. Of course, both of them resulted to be police states or failed states, or failing. And of course, there's a third one in the form of Somaliland, a breakaway region. It's also a place where, with very little regional cooperation. If you look at the structure in the format of the IGAD, even after its revitalization in the mid-90s, which resulted in better mandate, stronger mandate for IGAD to include issues of peace and security, regional economic integration. IGAD continued to be a very weak organization and a very weak, regional bloc. Most of IGAD's capacity emanated from the secretariat. Actually, even until now, all the major defining projects, all the major defining initiatives of IGAD are on project basis, strongly dependent on donors. So, IGAD's biggest initiative was mostly focused on, the relationship between its member states. And these member states, of course, as you know, if you look at the history of interstate wars, the wars between the member states of the African Union, you can count very few, and most of it is located in this region. There were 2 wars between Ethiopia and Somalia, and there was a war, of course, the infamous war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And even though there wasn't a war between a major full-fledged war between Ethiopia and Sudan, or Ethiopia and other members of its other neighbors, there were proxy wars. So it made it very, very difficult for any meaningful regional cooperation that resulting in a full-fledged regional economic community. So in the early 90s, of course, there was in the mid 90s, of course, there was a project that was championed by the Clinton administration following the end of the Cold War and at the backdrop of what happened in Rwanda. Washington had a project of creating a strong regional allies, an axis between Addis, Asmara, and Kampala. Ironically, of course, now, but Meles Zenawi, Isaias Afwerki, and Museveni, they were portrayed as the new breed of leaders in the continent, and they created a political and security partnership and coalition. First, of course, from the perspective of Washington, they were new, they could democratize their respective countries, but they were also a response to growing Islamic threats in Khartoum. But that coalition crumbled following the start of the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea in '98. In a way, after that, I think the next big regional cooperation and major regional security partnership between the different member states of the IGAD emerged, of course, with the conception of IGASOM in 2005. Then in 2004, of course, the transitional national government of Somalia was transformed into the transitional federal government following, the process in Nairobi. And IGAD was, of course, in the process of building and creating a mission, a military mission, which has numerous tracks with an aspiration of supporting the political and peace process in Somalia. But unfortunately, the reality on the ground, in a way, was much more dynamic and fast, and it's the creation of the Islamic Courts Union and the threat that was posed by the new movement to the transitional government based in Baidoa created a lot of nervousness. So Ethiopia had sent troops unilaterally to Somalia, and there were, of course, divisions within the region, regarding that intervention. But later on, of course, IGAD endorsed it. Of course, then later on, the AU came up with, of course, as a follow-up to IGASOM. AMISOM was endorsed, and as you know very well, at the peak of its mandate and operations, AMISOM succeeded in having 4 member states of the IGAD region, which is, of course, Ethiopia. Ethiopia joined later, of course. Until from 2006, 2012, of course, it left briefly in 2009. But for the 6 years, Ethiopia was not part of for AMISOM. But it included Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Djibouti. But the dynamics between the interests between the different forces represented within AMISOM wasn't always smooth, but most importantly, following the political transitions in Ethiopia and Sudan, and subsequent rapprochement with Eritrea, and recent perceived change of policy from Addis towards the peace and political process in Somalia by the government in Addis is resulting in, of course, major cracks, major differences, not only within AMISOM, but regarding the regional response and the regional cooperation towards Somalia. And right now, of course, we can say that some members of the, AMISOM, some members of the IGAD are pushing for, the end of such a mission. Especially following, major, the differences and border conflict between Ethiopia and Sudan. IGAD, as an organization, has become, in a way, some people are saying that it's dying a slow days. So with weak IGAD, I think it's become very, very difficult to have strong political backing and strong regional backing for the AMISOM project. Nothing, no proposal, no replacement is on the horizon, but we were finding ourselves in a position where, the probably arguably the most successful regional security cooperation, military cooperation by the IGAD region in the form of AMISOM is finding itself, in a critical juncture. And of course, the issue of geopolitics is also playing its role. This region is disproportionately exposed to paycheck diplomacy, and unfinished nation and state building projects are also, affecting relationships between the troop contributing countries to AMISOM. So in a way, this region is finding itself in a crossroads, and AMISOM is also finding itself in a very critical juncture, where regional cooperation, regional security partnerships are in a difficult juncture. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Ali, for this presentation on the Horn. I think actually we could make a very interesting comparison between West and the Horn now, because now we have the same security issue. We know, we have the question of fighting against violent extremism, but we have finally two totally opposite situations. You have a coalition in West Africa with the D5 Sahel, the same in Central Africa with the MJTF, and in the Horn, we still have no possibility of regional coalition, as you mentioned it. So I think it's very interesting. So maybe the question is about: is it the question of the proxy wars? Is it the question of the historical background? Is it the fact that we have actually a lead nation? Can we say that Ethiopia is strong enough to keep the lead in the Horn, and we don't have this leadership, even if we have Nigeria, but it seems it's not enough now? Can we say this is the difference? I don't know. It's again just sharing my thought on your presentation. Thank you again. So now, Dimpo, you are our specialist on the Southern Africa. So I give you the floor now to just say a word about the Mozambique issue, because I think it's very interesting. Now we have the background, this question of the ad hoc coalition in West, Central, and Eastern Africa. But now the question is, what about Southern Africa? What the Southern African states are doing with this announcement of the creation of regional security forces in Mozambique? Dimpo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amandine, and thank you to all the presenters that have shed light on the problematic of promoting African solutions to African problems, given the lack of requisite financial and institutional resources. This is a very important conversation that I'm very glad to participate in. So my contribution really is to highlight some of the difficulties in negotiating regional security cooperation first, and then secondly, security alliances on Mozambique's crisis in Cabo Delgado within the SADC configuration. Also given the fact that Mozambique is a member state that historically is averse to external involvement in its domestic affairs, and even the idea of creating military support alliances from within the region. And the other problem with the current status quo is that SADC is currently chaired by Mozambique. So Mozambique has effectively, over the past couple of months, been the one that is controlling what gets discussed on the peace and security agenda of SADC as far as it is concerned. So as far as we are all aware, for the last 4 years, Mozambique has been experiencing mass displacement and a growing humanitarian crisis at the back of an Islamist insurgency in its gas-rich province called Cabo Delgado, as you can see from the map. So from the end of 2017, the northern eastern part of the province became a stage of violent conflict when a group of armed insurgents, mainly composed of local youths with links to Tanzania and Kenya, unleashed a series of attacks in the areas of the coast with a higher Islamic concentration. Apparently, the whole initiative is to establish an Islamic caliphate in that region. As we can see again from the map, Cabo Delgado is the northernmost province of Mozambique, and it borders Tanzania in East Africa. Mozambique also shares borders with 5 other SADC member states, so that will be Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. Out of these 6 neighboring countries, 4 are landlocked and depend on Mozambique as a gateway to global markets. Insecurity, therefore, in Cabo Delgado could therefore threaten this trade, and this has been the basis for the support offered by these neighbors in helping Mozambique stem out the insurgency. The insurgency has also reinforced concern about maritime security in the Mozambican Channel, and local maritime security capacity generally along that belt and the East African coast is very limited, and it faces a lot of challenges that include, trafficking, illegal fishing, and the potential resurgence of piracy. The insurgency in Cabo Delgado is complicated, and so are the strategies to counter it. There are so many hypotheses as to the roots of the insurgency. We have those focusing on the grievance aspects of the conflict, issues around poverty and frustration of social expectations, as related to the exploitation of natural resources there among local youth. There are also historical ethno-linguistic conflicts in that region between the coastal and inland peoples. The other hypotheses speak to the regional dimensions of the conflict, which are pronounced, namely the relationship between the insurgency and terrorist cells in East Africa, countries like Somalia, Tanzania, and Kenya. And lastly, there is also the confluence of various international, regional, and local economic interests in the Mozambique Channel. These are related not only to the control of a massively lucrative energy corridor, but also to illegal drug, timber, and ivory routes. So what this underlines, really, this complexity that I'm talking about, underlines that there is a very strong link between violent extremism, organized crime, and local conflict as far as the Cabo Delgado crisis is concerned. What we see in Mozambique is a shift in conflict dynamics in the country, from an end of the Renamo lower-level insurgency that was the aftershock of the Mozambican civil war, to a potentially more intractable insurgency. And this has to be kept in mind when we are talking about the potential for negotiating allies, because you have to understand the way that the Mozambican government handled the insurgency and ending the insurgency with Renamo. So Mozambique finally signed a peace agreement to end its long-running conflict with Renamo in 2019. The agreement was a result of years of mediation processes that initially were locally driven. Renamo had requested international mediation from the EU, the Vatican, and the South African President Jacob Zuma, but ultimately those negotiations became futile. And eventually, local efforts and the fact that the balance of power tipped in favor of the government forces led to this agreement. So this agreement bolstered a lot of confidence in the Mozambican government's ability to address political violence and low-level insurgencies on its own. Over the course of the 7-year conflict with Renamo, there was a lot of pressure from neighboring countries that were affected by the spillover effects of the violence, notably Malawi and Zimbabwe, to help stem out the threat. But for example, Zimbabwe had offered to send its own troops to support the Mozambican government against Renamo. Zimbabwe is an old ally of Mozambique. It had supported Mozambique in the 1980s, but this support was rejected by Mozambique. So what we see now is a similar pattern in Mozambique's handling of the Cabo Delgado insurgency and its negotiation or efforts at finding alliances and ad hoc arrangements. Mozambican President Nyusi has been very reluctant to ask for help from within the region. And again, this is despite the growing frequency of the attacks and the massive statements it has generated into neighboring Tanzania in particular. The government has instead relied on the support of private military contractors from Russia and South Africa. Now we know that it's receiving training and logistical support from Portugal, from the Americans, but this is being done bilaterally. And more recently, when France was in South Africa with a joint press briefing, France has now offered to help Mozambique in the fight against the insurgency, obviously given France the fact that Total has a $20 billion liquefied gas project in northern Mozambique. Mozambique has also been in talks with Rwanda, given its experience in combating terrorism and in trying to bring stability to the Central African Republic. So in terms of African allies or the search for allies, what Mozambique is really looking for, it appears, and what it thinks it can get from the SADC region, is looking for countries with a relatively good track record of combating terrorism and insurgencies. We know that South Africa, one could argue, in fact, that South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi have some of this experience as countries that deployed their troops to the Forced Intervention Brigade in 2013 in the DRC. But this conversation has been very blocked within the region, and it's been very difficult for SADC member states to establish the kind of support that Mozambique needs. This has been complicated for two reasons. Number one, Mozambique has generally offered very few and contradictory explanations to SADC member states on what is happening in Cabo Delgado and on the seriousness of the problem. I've spoken to our colleagues at SADC and from the Botswana government. Botswana is chairing the organ at the moment, and this is the frustration that they keep on repeating. The first time that Mozambique admitted to the seriousness of the problem, in fact, and used terrorism to describe these attacks was last year, May 2020, at a SADC summit. It has since not expressed an external threat to its sovereignty from these activities. It's very important to emphasize that, because this is required to legally enforce and motivate military support or even the search for allies. But what has happened since then is that SADC sent in, Mozambique finally allowed SADC to send in a technical assessment mission in the province in mid-April. So it was a technical assessment mission that was carried over a course of about 7 days. This was constituted by representatives from, obviously, Botswana being the chair of the SADC organ, Angola, South Africa, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. And so what we have now is something more concrete in terms of a SADC position on Cabo Delgado. there is a technical assessment mission report that made the following recommendation. The first recommendation is that SADC should deploy SADC forces in 3 domains. So that would be air, maritime, and ground. And these forces are supposed to support the Mozambican army to neutralize the insurgents. Zimbabwe in particular, again, has been pushing for this. The second recommendation is that training and logistical support be provided to the Mozambican army, and this is the recommendation that Mozambique seems to be amenable to. And then the last recommendation is for the creation of a coordination mechanism and a joint intelligence fusion center. This is meant to facilitate intelligence sharing among SADC member states, and this again is an imperative given the lack of information about the situation on the ground among member states. But this intelligence coordinating mechanism should also work with countries that have a naval presence in the Mozambican Channel. The paradox, however, is that this mission report is yet to be ratified, and for now it's just a set of recommendations on the possible actions that SADC could take. The mission report is yet to be ratified, and this should have been done at the last SADC summit, but it kept on being postponed. So the official speculation has been that President Nyusi has been engineering an indefinite postponement of the summit. But the summit is now planned for next week. But generally what you see is that on the part of Mozambique, there's very little appetite for creating coalitions or military alliances from within the region in dealing with the insurgency in Cabo Delgado. So here are the 3 most important challenges in building coalitions in the SADC region. In as far as managing the Cabo Delgado crisis is concerned. These are very peculiar and particular challenges given the political culture and disposition of Mozambique when it comes to military cooperation. Yeah. So the first is the need to have very clear political justification and consent from the country concerned. This is a prerequisite of all alliance formations. Mozambique is not explicitly stated that it is under an armed attack as a result of the insurgency. They keep on referring to terrorist activities or insurgent activities, political violence. Mozambique has also not expressed explicitly that there is an external threat to its sovereignty. These 2 conditions are completely necessary to start the conversation on forging military coalitions under SADC law. So in that respect, the SADC Mutual Defense Pact would then be evoked, but this could be complicated, and I think this was the point that Yves mentioned in the beginning, that when you have these kind of defense alliances and defense pacts, they can become very complicated to enforce because they have to be subordinated to the provisions of the UN Charter. Yeah. The last challenge is that obviously regional coalitions and military alliances cannot be enforced by SADC. I mean, they need to be negotiated. And what SADC has recommended to Mozambique in the last summit is that, okay, if you want to bring in Rwanda, for example, because you have more confidence in the ability to support the counterterrorism in Cabo Delgado, this has to be done through regional channels. But the question will always remain as to the financing of such an arrangement, because the budget that is supposed to support the implementation of the technical assessment mission that I just highlighted has not been made available. There's very little money to support this. And so you wonder if this will speak to Katarina's point about issues of leverage and ownership. If we have this regional force, who's going to finance it? If the EU finances it, and you've got countries that are interested and implicated in the matter, like France and Portugal, will there be a loss of political control over the way that that whole crisis is managed? I therefore conclude on 3 recommendations. Amandine had asked me to make recommendations to the EU on this matter. Okay, so obviously it goes without saying that support should be provided to Mozambique on the terms requested by the government of Mozambique, especially the underlining of logistical and support and training to the Mozambican army. But I hope that in that conversation, in that support, the EU could ask diplomatically for greater transparency and information sharing in the way that the support is used and the efficiency of the support, as it were. The second recommendation that I think is very important is that the EU should support the call for a collective undertaking. This issue of having to negotiate with Rwanda outside the regional arrangement is very uncomfortable for the member states, especially given the fact that there could be a regional spillover of the conflict and there could be negative consequences from this coalition that Mozambique is trying to forge with Rwanda. So the EU should definitely support the call for more of a collective undertaking that is regionally oriented, but it must be domestically led. Let me leave you with the final recommendation, because in my view, when I see the negotiations that Mozambique is undertaking with countries that are outside the region, the fact that this is the Cabo Delgado insurgency straddles East Africa, also going into the Mozambican Channel. This, for me, is a bigger issue that extends to the peripheries of SADC. It's really bigger than SADC. This is an issue that SADC also needs to admit as incorporating other regions. So I therefore suggest the push for perhaps an EAC ECAS SADC Peace and Security Summit. This may be necessary. So the role of the EU in this respect, if this is something that is feasible, the EU could then assist with the necessary skills or capacity building that would be required to manage the complex logistics and coordination efforts of such a mission. That's where I would end.
Thank you, Dimpo. Thank you so much for that. I think maybe one of the takeaways, probably the shift in conflict dynamics you mentioned. I think it's very interesting to actually maybe confirm some assumption we can have. This is the fact that actually the nature of conflicts has an influence, has an direct impact on the nature of the regional cooperation, because usually we don't have a coalition. I mean, of course, we could have it within the SADC, but the way we are seeing at the moment in West and Central Africa, we didn't have that in Southern Africa. And we can see that now we have the question of violent extremism on the table. And now we see emerging this question of creating another coalition. It is like this, we have this impression that the same causes should have the same effects, the same issue of in terms of type of insecurity, violent extremism should have the same answer, meaning that we should have another coalition. So I think we should have a deeper look and see in the future, in the long term, how this coalition will evolve if we have it at the end, because it's also a very good laboratory to see to what extent this coalition can be developed in Southern Africa. One of your recommendations is also a good transition for Daniel, because you said that we should have a regional coordination mechanism. I think it's obvious. Now we have this, it could be maybe the more effective, efficient solution if we want to tackle this issue of proliferation of other coalition, as mentioned by Yves. But the question is it really a good solution in the long term? What is the limits? And maybe Daniel can say a word about it. Daniel is actually at the EU coordination cell, at the EU Regional Advisory and Coordination Cell to the Sahel. So maybe Daniel, you can share some your part of your experience in this coordination. And of course, if you want to share some lessons learned about your experience, it would be very appreciated. Thank you. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Amandine. You know, each time I am hearing something or listening something saying that we need a coordination mechanism, I am used to say that it's the beginning of the end, because you cannot imagine the number of coordination mechanisms we are trying to implement everywhere, and I think we are now in a context, in a situation where we need a coordination mechanism to coordinate other mechanism of coordination. And I'm not joking. It's really the situation we are facing with, and this situation is coming, I guess, from the fact that we are speaking about a long-term conflict that need long-term resolution, and at the same time we have decision makers in the EU, but also in the different member states of the EU, that are willing to solve this problem very quickly. I would say to solve the problem in the time frame of their own political mandate, which is absolutely not feasible. So because they want or they need good positive result, they are inviting every 6 months a new strategy, new initiatives, and that each time needs new coordination mechanism, because we are having so many initiatives, so many strategies, so many decision makers also, that there is also the need to coordinate everything, including to coordinate the mechanism of coordination. So this is basically the situation we are facing with. Anyway, you know that the EU is very much taking care of the stability and security of the J5 areas, amongst others. And they made 3 years ago the following statement, which was mainly to say that despite the budget invested in this area of the Sahel region by the EU, despite the enormous diplomatic political efforts, despite the existing security mission of the EU, despite all the actors, the situation was degrading. So they had this last initiative to imagine a regional advisory and coordination cell that I am directing since 2019, aiming to do what? I think one of my mission is to answer what is very well known by all the people who have who know basically what does it mean planning an operation or planning a crisis management mission. And we are always recommending to our young colleague to always ask this double question: are we doing the right things, and are we doing right the things? And I guess 3 years ago, the EU masters, they have tried to respond to these two questions. And obviously the answer was no, because otherwise we would already have reached the final objective of this whole crisis management. So they decided to create this cell. Basically, what are we doing? We are supporting cross-border cooperation in the J5 Sahel. We are supporting regional cooperation structures of the J5 Sahel, and we are enhancing national capacities of the 5 countries of the J5 Sahel. Basically, on the defense sector, I forgot to say that for the very first time, this EU mission is a civil mission, because I have the 2 mandates, how to improve and how to support the joint the J5 Sahel Joint Force, which is a military force, and I have also the mandate to contribute to develop the capacity of the security forces. So this is the first civil mission of the EU, and I have a civil mandate given by the member state, by the way. So we are supporting the J5 Sahel Joint Force. We are supporting the internal security forces of the 5 countries of the J5, and we are also supporting the J5 Sahel institutions through the Executive Secretariat, which is deployed in Nouakchott, Mauritania. In concrete terms, what are we doing? On the defense side, we are, or at least what did we do since 2019? We have developed a training planning of the officers of the joint force. You have to know that before the creation of this cell, we knew that the 5 countries were sending staff officer in the different headquarters of the J5 Sahel Joint Force without any pre-deployment training. So the people were arriving in their headquarters without knowing in advance what they were expected to do, and especially without being educated and trained on what they were expected to do. So now we have implemented this pre-deployment training of all the staff officers of the J5 Sahel Joint Force. And this pre-deployment training is collectively undertook by the EU training mission, by the joint force itself, and also by all the other actors, meaning people coming from the French Barkhane operation, people coming from the UN agencies. So we have developed a sort of a concept of let's make the job together instead of acting separately in our own pillar, if you like. This is mainly a job of coordinating. And the coordination doesn't mean taking the lead. The coordination, the way I am envisaging my mission, is to show that all these actors, and to be honest, so many actors, they have to work together in order to make sure that we are sharing the same objectives, and we are, let's say, we are talking to our local partners together instead of separately. Because it's true to say also that our partners are very much playing a sort of local game, having so many actors talking separately to them, and finally proposing the same thing, spending so many money to do exactly the same thing. This is another piece of our difficulties we are facing in the J5 Sahel region. The second interesting thing we made in the past years was to convince, and I insist on the word to convince, the different CHOD and ministers of defense of the 5 countries that they had to accept what we are calling the judiciarization of the military operations. What does it mean? That means to convince militaries of the 5 J5 countries that they have to embed in their battalions gendarmes coming from the internal security forces, aiming to do 2 different things. The first one is to fight against impunity, because you know that we are facing increasing exaction coming from the military forces themselves. So they are these covert units embedded in the military battalions are the first row of how to fight against impunity. And if you are fighting against impunity, you are working on how to work on increasing good relationship between the population and the military forces deployed in the different countries. The second thing we have done with this judiciarization was to make sure that from the military operations to the judge, we have a full-fledged chain of gendarmerie, police, security forces, justice, to make sure that all the people who are captured during the military operations could, at the end of the day, be presented to a judge. Because as long as we are speaking about fighting against the terrorism, we are speaking about internal security issue, we are not speaking about adversaries of militaries. We are speaking about people that has to be judged. Otherwise, if we are capturing, and this is what was happening in the last 5 years, if you are capturing a bad guys north of Mali, if you are not capable of providing the judge with all the evidence the judge need to convince and to condemn the bad guys, the bad guys is already present in the new mission. So it's an imperative necessity to bring all evidence needed by the different justice chain of command of the 5 countries. This is basically what the 2 pillars we have invested in the last 2 years. And I don't want to be so long, so I will conclude by not a lesson learned, but probably with a warning. I don't know if we will be successful, but what I can say is that the EU is operating the appropriate tool to face with all these conflicts we are facing in the Sahel region. The problem is all these tools need a long-term time frame, I would say, to provide effects. While at the same time, back to my first or second observation during my introduction, our decision maker needs immediate success to capitalize on, unfortunately. And this is basically the main stake we are facing with. The second one is when you are having a look on the different mandate of the missions, I'm speaking about MINUSMA or the J5 Joint Force, or even with the French Barkhane operation. Most of the time, the end state of these missions are we have to eradicate terrorism. But this is not the goal, because terrorism is not the root causes of the different conflicts. This is one of the consequences. So as long as we are having ad hoc coalition or regional forces or national forces that are making the mistake of having the wrong end state, we will not fight against, we will not be successful. Fighting against terrorism, again, is fighting against the consequence of the phenomenon we are facing with. And this is not fighting against the root causes. So we are, of course, we have to fight against terrorism, but if we are doing only fighting against terrorism instead of also fighting against the root causes, we will fail. And unfortunately, I'm not so optimistic, because as long as you can have attacks in Burkina Faso or in Mali, as long as you are additionally having, let's say, there is. I will finish with this last example. In Mali, it's already no longer counter-terrorism warfare. This is counter-guerrilla warfare. The difference between the two is that in the first, you are fighting an enemy. In the second, you have to fight to make sure that you can get again the support of the population. Because in Mali, we have more and more villages that are making the choice to be protected by armed groups instead of being protected by the government, because the government is no longer doing what they are expected to do. This is possibly the most important warning I'd like to send you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, to be very outspoken. This is also the opportunity for this kind of seminar to have very frank and open debate. So thank you for playing the game, I would say. And at least you anticipate on one of my questions, actually, which was, does the EU has the capacity to take into account the challenge of coalition building? Because Yves mentioned that actually there is positive effects, but there is also negative effects. So maybe in the Q&A session, if we have the opportunity, and if you want to go deeper on this, on the answer, if you want. And the other question is more to problematize the issue, because you describe what you did and what you do in a daily way, in a daily frequency. What kind of unattended or unexpected results do you see in your support to the G5 Sahel? Because we know that sometimes we want to be very effective, as you said, but we can have very positive or negative. It's not always negative, but what kind of negative or positive unexpected effect you see in your daily work? So now I'm going to leave the floor for the Q&A session. So you can raise your virtual hands if you have any question, and you can also use the chat. So please feel free to ask your question.
If I may, I can kick it off with the first question while people are still gathering. But first of all, thank you very much. Since I work on regional demarcations and how they're constructed and deconstructed, is really fascinating. And one question that came to me specifically when Danielle, but also Yves were talking, from a theoretical point of view, we assume that ad hoc coalitions are less binding, so that it's easier for a member to join but also to leave, which makes them a bit more volatile. So but that is a theory that we know. So I was wondering if in practice, maybe, do you find this confirmed, or actually it's rather not the case, because once you're in, it's still a sort of a Brexit-like complications if you want to get out. So on paper it's easy to leave, but then in practice you can't. So this is something I'd be interested in, but I'll leave the floor to others as well. Thank you.
Okay, I also have a few questions in this case, since I see that the audience is a bit shy today. So first, thank you very much for your contributions. I think it was really interesting. And to have a few questions. The first one is for Yves and Katharina, I guess, more specifically. I was wondering, to which extent do you think that this ad hoc coalition, such as the G5 Sahel, pose an issue of agency? Do they have less leverage to impose their own priorities to the international partners which fund them, compared, for example, to the REX or the African Union, or is it basically the same? And I think it's quite a problem in the case of the G5 Sahel, but I know much less the case of the MJTF. So maybe you can distinguish also between the two ad hoc coalitions. Then I have a question for Katharina specifically. Could you say that the ASIRC actually shows a desire from some AU member states to de-regionalize the APSA to a certain extent, and which other African countries are pushing for that besides South Africa? And then I have a last question for Mr. Grammatico, which is, do you still think it was the right choice to support fully the G5 Sahel as a main regional partner to manage the conflict, instead, for example, to continuing to support ECOWAS or turn to the African Union and what Katharina has described, like the ASIRC, for example? Thank you.
Just Halle has to leave in 5 minutes. So I mean, Frank and Lisa, maybe if you agreed, we can just take a few more minutes after the. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But Ale has to leave in 5 minutes. So if you have a specific question for Ale, you can please ask them now. Thank you. Yes, Erna, please.
Yes, I think more of a general question. Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. I would be curious of your opinion on how the new EU financing of African peace and security would, in your opinion, impact the current situation and political situation. Thank you so much.
Thanks. The last time I checked, there was still a confusion. First, with the with the merger of the Commission for Peace and Security and Commission for Political Affairs at the African Union, there is confusion on which department, which specific unit must be in charge of communicating with the EU regarding the new arrangement. And I also heard from the Brussels side as well, there are divisions within the Commission and within the different member states on how to go forward with the new arrangement. So it looks, at stands now, it looks there's no clarity regarding, the actual implication of the new arrangement on the funding and sustainability of cases like AMISOM or other African Union peace support missions and operations.
Thank you, Ali. Now maybe we can just start with if you want to answer the question, please, and then Daniel.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for these interesting presentations and insights as well. Maybe to start with Frank's question, I might have some connection problems, by the way, so if there is an issue, then just let me know. But to start with Frank's question, are ad hoc coalitions less binding? Well, from a purely theoretical perspective, I think we often perceive ad hoc coalitions as a group of states joining for a specific problem on a specific in a specific time frame. And I think what we've learned from Daniel, if I may, his presentation is basically that with counterterrorism ad hoc coalitions, for instance, is there such a consensus on what this actual problem is? And this problem is probably much broader than just countering these terrorist forces. So in that sense, I think this might explain why some coalitions like the G5 Sahel or like the multinational joint task force, that they are not so strictly bound in time and strictly problem driven, and this might lead them to long lasting coalitions. Then on Elisa's question on the leverage to impose agendas, I find it a very difficult one to answer. I think here, but it would be interesting also to hear about the coordination efforts by Daniel, for instance, in how far this makes a difference, whether there is a very strong lead nation or if there is more of a cooperation among equals, maybe, such as in the G5 Sahel. If that makes this more difficult or much more of an easy exercise. I'm also curious to hear about that.
Thank you, Daniel, and then Katerina.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I will start with Elisa's questions on the agency of the G5 Sahel. I mean, it's a very interesting thing because it's not as easy as saying, okay, there's a lot of EU money and French lobbying, so there is no agency by the G5 Sahel actors. But like a very good example to see that is how under IBK, it was very easy for Mali to really use the G5 Sahel to push away, so to say, criticism from ECOWAS. Because when you look into the ministerial meetings of Chief of Defense Staff and other ECOWAS meetings since 2012, other ECOWAS representatives have been very clear on Mali that you are not managing your crisis. This is spilling over into other countries. You need to do more. There was a big pressure. And of course, then to have this support within the G5 Sahel, that was very positive for Malian government to get rid of this ECOWAS opposition. So in that sense, you still have African agency, but is it actually helping to solve the problem? And I think this relates nicely to what Dimfo told us about Mozambique, right? That actually the government doesn't really want to acknowledge that they're having a problem. And that was the same in Mali for years and years. Our army can handle it, but no, it can't. And it's a similar story there. Maybe on the ASRIC point as well, this de-regionalization, and I think that is indeed a trend, that the sort of security regions we have seen developing under ABSA are being called into question, And with ASPRIC, it was, of course, South Africa who was very much involved, but also Tanzania. And I think there it was this sort of holy alliance between Tanzania and South Africa at a certain point, because they had the success story in the DRC against the M23 with the Force Intervention Brigade. And so they wanted to institutionalize that. But there were a number of other countries, Angola, but even a lot of the Sahel countries, when you really look from West to East Africa, who thought that this was a way to maintain control of their militaries, still be able to intervene and get training, which would be better than with the African standby force. And I think we have a larger paradigm shift here, where it's going away from the sort of UN peacekeeping model and also this idea of brigades, like we had with the UN Shibrik, more towards ad hoc coalitions and extremely robust military interventions. Yeah.
Thank you, Katerina. Sorry, Daniel.
Yes, thank you. First of all, speaking about ad hoc coalition, I don't think we could say that ad hoc coalition is the best way to react, or the regional forces and cooperation should be the best. I don't think we should prioritize. Why? Because the deterioration of the situation and the size of the area we are speaking about make me thinking that we should take everything, because we will never have all the assets, tools, and means we need to fight against all this phenomenon. So, and you know that most of the countries, they need a very good reason to commit troops in that kind of region. So it's the reason why, for example, that ad hoc coalition is most of the time the best way to commit troops in that kind of region, because it's and it's, I guess it's already said a couple of minutes ago, it's most of the time ad hoc coalition is based on a sort of lead nation that would like to take the lead, but need to speak about a sort of coalition because of the lead of legitimacy of its action. And soon, you know, the Americans are always doing like this. They are speaking about coalition because they can show some flags coming from a very, sometimes short and very small country, but never mind. There is another flag than their own flag, and they are good to go. This is basically what is happening for decades. We know that. But again, back to our African issue, the size of the area and the direction of the situation, we need everyone. As long as the cooperation, the political objectives are fixed and determined by the local, regional cooperation, and not by the one who are coming to support them. And sometimes it's not necessarily the case. The second comment is on the European Peace Facility. I want just to give you an example of what will be feasible with this new financial instrument of the EU, instead of what we had in the previous time. With the EPF, without the EPF, when the EU decided to support the J5 joint force, the EU could give some money, but they couldn't buy any weapons or any military tools dedicated to the J5 joint force. So we had to imagine again a huge coordination mechanism to make sure that we could take into account what the J5 countries need for the J5 joint force. Then we were founding the EU what they needed, and then we had to find some other countries to deliver the equipment needed by the J5 joint force. With the EPF, the EU is now, or will be now, able to do everything from scratch. So the EU will definitely be able to support from the very beginning of a mechanism a regional force or a country or an ad hoc coalition from the very beginning. Another example, interesting one, because before being the director of this EU cell, I was the director ops of the EU in Brussels. And I remember where we were training the Central African forces. So we were training the Central African forces, and then the president of Central African Republic said to the EU, so we are trained, now we need weapons. And because of the EU treaty, we couldn't give any weapons to the troops who have been trained. And who did that? Russia. And suddenly we saw Russian troops coming in Central Africa just because the treaty of the EU couldn't allow us to give the weapons to the battalions we have just trained, which is totally stupid. So now it will be over. So it's very interesting to say that the EU will be provided with this EPF, the very interesting tool they are and they were lacking in the past. I will finish with the fact that, of course, if we are sharing the burden of this crisis or this many crises in Africa, with many different coalition of the willing, ad hoc coalition, regional troops, regional forces, there is the need of at least a unique political coordination of everything, because most of the time when we are adding all these different coalitions, they are not sharing the same end states. So if we want to reach the appropriate objective, we have to share the same political end state, and only regional organization can give us what is the appropriate political end state, which is not yet the case. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just we can take just a few minutes left, a few minutes more. Jens, it's good to see you here. You had a question, and then we're going to finish. You need to turn your mic on.
That's good hit. So I was saying thank you, Amandine, and thank you everyone for these interesting presentations. I'm Jens Herposheimer from Leipzig University, a researcher there in a project that studies interregional practices between the European Union and different African regional organizations. And I wanted to come back to the perceived advantages and disadvantages of ad hoc coalitions. As Frank already hinted at, the advantages may not be what they seem to be. I would point in a similar direction, saying that maybe some of the disadvantages also are not that much of disadvantages, and especially regarding the common assumption that these ad hoc coalitions somehow undermine the existing regional frameworks. These seem to me always be based on very particular expectations of what ECOWAS, for example, or the African Union should be doing regarding these kind of threats that these ad hoc coalitions are addressing. And Yves mentioned their credibility and legitimacy being threatened and the interest of donors to ECOWAS. And I would obviously agree that they are missing a chance here, intervening in these things more forcefully. But I would at least put a question mark whether they actually put a question mark behind whether they actually lose something by not or through these ad hoc coalitions, as they may not have been in a position to intervene in any case, you know. So they may just lose something that they would not have had anyways. So it may be misleading to think that they are losing something, and especially the African Union has been very successful in post-hoc integrating some of these initiatives into its ABSA framework, so they may be even profiting from that. So this is more of a comment, but I guess there's questions in there as well.
Thank you, Jens. Unfortunately, we should stop here. I think we have a very stimulating and interesting debate. Thank you, all of you, and I hope to see you again in the next opportunity. Just to remind you that this is just a starting, because we plan to organize an event, hopefully maybe in October or November. We need to precise it, and we hope in Brussels this time. So let's. I hope we will be lucky this time. So in the meantime, take care and see you there. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.